An explosive biography of Camilla, to mark her 70th birthday next month, lifts the lid on her affair with Charles. Yesterday we revealed how the prince was driven to the brink of a breakdown by his marriage to Diana. Today, she tells how Diana menaced Camilla before two unprecedented television interviews blew apart their marriages and rocked the monarchy. This is the third extract of Camilla's biography written by Penny Junor. By the end of 1986, the time Camilla came back into Charles's life, initially as a platonic friend, Diana had already produced an heir and a spare. Diana was nobody's fool. She'd soon realized she could feed stories to the newspapers herself, using them as a way of punishing her husband, while controlling what they said about her. Eventually, she found out that Charles was seeing his former lover again. And although Diana was having affairs of her own, she grew increasingly obsessed with the woman she considered her rival. In 1989, the princess famously confronted her at a party thrown by Lady Annabel Goldsmith at her home in Richmond. "Camilla," she said, "I would just like you to know that I know exactly what is going on between you and Charles. I wasn't born yesterday." For her part, Camilla was furious that Diana should have made such a public scene. 2 years later, the princess agreed to be the prime source for the book about her life, Diana, Her True Story. When it was serialized in a paper and later published, it caused a furore. You can listen to our selections of this book in our channel. Just check out our playlist called Diana's Secret Tapes. Suddenly, the whole of Britain was reading shocking revelations about Diana's suicide bids, her bulimia, her husband's indifference to her, his defects as a parent, and his obsession with Camilla Parker Bowles. 11 years into her marriage, Diana was very angry, very bitter, and very unwell. The War of the Waleses was at its height. They were living largely separate lives. Both had lovers, and Diana, who waged war far more effectively than her husband was prepared to do and say anything to damage him. The most important revelation in the book was that she suffered from bulimia, a disease that involves secret binging followed by self-induced vomiting. Such binges are often followed by strong mood swings expressed as guilt, depression, self-hate, and even suicidal behavior. And while the roots of the illness lie in childhood and a disordered family background, uncertainty and anxiety in adult life can provide the trigger. Significantly, sufferers can appear to be happy, even spending their lives trying to help others. Yet there is rage beneath the sunny smiles, anger that they're often afraid to express. This is why the Morton book was Diana's truth, but may not necessarily have been everyone else's truth. Richard Allard, Charles's private secretary, told me the prince and one or two others mentioned in the book were baffled because the stories were true in essence, but most of them had been given a spin. Which meant they weren't quite like how anyone at the time remembered them. Be that as it may, from the moment people started reading Diana, Her True Story, life as they'd known it was over for Diana, for Charles, for William and Harry, for Camilla, and for the entire Parker Bowles family. The young princes, then aged 10 and 8, were boarding at Ludgrove, a boys' prep school in Berkshire. Although the people who ran the school tried to shield the boys from newspapers, there was only so much they could do. William and Harry couldn't help but hear the rows between their parents, or notice that their father was seldom there. However, they spent most of their time with nannies, who did their best to distract and insulate them from what was happening. The Parker Bowles children, on the other hand, had been far less aware of trouble on the home front. If asked, Tom and Laura would probably have said they had a very happy home life. Both Andrew and Camilla had been discreet about their extramarital activities, always making sure that the children came first. Indeed, both their children were blissfully unaware that anything was amiss. The Prince of Wales, Sir, as they called him, was a regular visitor, but he always had been. He was Tom's godfather, and they both loved seeing him. Their absence for large chunks of the year at boarding school also helped preserve their mother's secret. Plus she was always there for them at half-term and in the holidays. Yet now, having been an entirely private wife and mother, Camilla was suddenly a household name. She was painted not just as a Scarlet Woman, but as one who had caused the Princess of Wales years of torment and pain. From then on, it became impossible for Camilla to leave her home without being photographed. And then the poisonous letters began to arrive. On December 9, 1992, Prime Minister John Major announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales had opted for separation but had no plans to divorce. The following month, the Sunday Mirror published the transcript of a tape recording that was immediately dubbed Camilla Gate. It was a telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded in 1989, the sort of late-night chat that should never be overheard. It lasted 11 minutes and was undeniably genuine, but the recording wasn't of one single conversation, it included bits of several, conducted on different nights and spliced together. Charles would often phone Camilla late at night no matter where he was in the world. He felt better if he could hear her reassuring voice before he went to sleep. The part of the tape that everyone remembers was embarrassing beyond words. Charles was saying he couldn't bear being without her. He said, "I'll just live inside your trousers or something. It would be much easier." "What are you going to turn into?" Camilla said with a laugh. "A pair of knickers." They both laughed. "Oh, you're going to come back as a pair of knickers." "Oh, God forbid, a Tampax," he laughed. "Just my luck." Camilla had spent most of their conversation boosting Charles's confidence, telling him he was underestimating himself as usual, showing an interest in his work, and making him feel good about himself, which no one else did. And he, in turn, was tender and loving and passionate, telling her how proud he was of her, and how her great achievement had been to love him. Camilla was branded a marriage wrecker and adulterer, while the serially unfaithful Andrew Parker Bowles found himself in the curious position of being the wronged husband. The harassment intensified. Camilla became the butt of lewd jokes, crude cartoons, lurid headlines. She had disturbing phone calls at all hours of the day and night, received abusive letters, and became a virtual prisoner, alone for a lot of the time, in a big house in the country with no security. Life became horrendous, not just for her but for all her immediate family. How anyone comes back from that sort of public humiliation is hard to imagine. Most people would have been crushed by it, but Camilla internalized the pain and presented a brave face. She has a strong instinct for self-preservation, a tendency to put her head in the sand and not think about things that are too difficult. She also has an unerring ability to laugh even in the most terrible of situations, and her family are the same. They closed ranks, rallied round, and kept her spirits up. Her mother Rosalind was not well then. Her osteoporosis was quietly killing her, she was in a wheelchair, and on so many painkillers that, by 1993, she wasn't fully aware of what was going on. This was a blessing. Camilla's father Bruce was a tower of strength and her greatest support, while her friends were also fiercely loyal, forming a protective ring around her. No one judged, no one spoke to the press. Her friend John Irwin did her shopping for her in Sainsbury's. Her main concern was for her children. Tom was at Oxford by then, and Laura was 17 and still at school. But they both had loyal friends who kept any excessive sniggering at bay. Diana was not well during those years from the late 80s to the mid-90s. She saw conspiracies everywhere. She abruptly dropped friends, family, and people who worked for her, and was convinced that her husband's office was trying to discredit her. She also left disturbing messages on people's answering machines and pagers. Camilla received a number of threatening and unnerving calls from the princess in the middle of the night. Without saying who was calling, she'd typically say, "I've sent someone to kill you. They're outside in the garden. Look out of the window, can you see them?" Suffice to say, many of the people around Diana walked on eggshells, not knowing what she might do from hour to hour. As the 25th anniversary of the investiture of the Prince of Wales approached, writer and broadcaster Jonathan Dimbleby was invited by Charles's private secretary to make a documentary and write an accompanying book on the prince's life. It began as a well-intentioned exercise. But Charles, the private man, the public role, seen by 14 million viewers in 1994, was directly responsible for Andrew divorcing Camilla, for Diana's devastating Panorama interview and for her divorce from the Prince of Wales. For one reason, for the first time, the prince had admitted his adultery. Now it was official. And the fallout was disastrous. Friends leapt to Camilla's defense. "Frankly," said one, "Charles has behaved like an absolute pig and landed Camilla right in it. She has done absolutely nothing to deserve this after all the support she has given him over the years through difficult times." And what of Camilla's husband? After Charles's confession, Andrew felt his hand had been well and truly forced. He'd stayed with Camilla for the past 5 years, the period in which she and Charles had been seeing each other again, for the sake of the children. For his part, he'd been involved for some years with Rosemary Pittman, whose husband Hugh was a friend and fellow polo player. The two couples had known each other for many years, but Rose had finally got fed up with her husband's roving eye and, knowing there was a vacancy, had fallen into Andrew's arms. Camilla was well aware of this and liked Rose. They remained friends. Despite this unorthodox arrangement, Andrew and Camilla had somehow managed to continue with their normal lives. Together, they'd go to dinner parties, see family and friends or stay at home with the children. Then, when the opportunities arose, he would see Rose, while she would see the prince. There's no doubt Camilla had been happy with the way things were. So, understandably, she was annoyed with Charles for making his televised confession. Andrew's position was now untenable. It was one thing for their friends and families to know about his wife's love affair, quite another for the entire world to know. Brigadier Parker Bowles, the director of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, was now Britain's most famous cuckold. Besides, he already knew that Camilla's affair wasn't a mere fling. Some years before, on a Sunday night, Andrew, who had to be in London during the week, had come back to the flat he shared with his brother-in-law Nick Paravicini, looking utterly crestfallen. In fact, Nick had never seen him that upset in all the years he'd known him. That weekend, at the family's country home, Andrew had found some letters that indicated his wife's affair was not the harmless fling he thought it was. He was shattered. It was the real thing. She was in love. Even so, he hadn't planned to leave his wife until he'd quit the army. Their son Tom had gone to university and their daughter Laura had left school. But now that he'd been bounced into it, he wanted to marry Rose, now a divorcee herself. When Andrew told Camilla he wanted a divorce, she was shocked. In her characteristic way, she hadn't wanted to think about the future. The whole thing was too difficult to contemplate. The children were less surprised. They were grown up by now, and coped with the split remarkably well because it was so very amicable. Camilla's world seemed to be imploding. The Dimbleby broadcast had coincided with the death of her mother Rosalind at the age of 72. Grieving and in shock, Camilla spent a lot of time with her sister, hidden away at Annabel's large family house at Storpane in Dorset. Even her divorce was no longer a strictly private affair. In November 1995, Diana released a final salvo, her interview with Martin Bashir for the BBC current affairs programme Panorama. Looking pale and vulnerable, with heavy black kohl lining her eyes, she brushed away the odd tear as she explained why her marriage had failed. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she said memorably, "so it was a bit crowded." Charles didn't watch the programme, though he was told about it. But Camilla saw it at home with her family. At this point, the Queen finally lost her patience, and asked her son and daughter-in-law to end the marriage as early as practicable. The divorce could not have been more acrimonious. Richard Allard, who handled it for Charles, spent several hours almost every day for several months, closeted with lawyers. By July 1996, a settlement was reached that was thought to be worth more than £17 million. On Allard's advice, St James's Palace issued a statement saying the Prince of Wales had no intention of remarrying. It was a gesture meant to bridge the divide between the two palaces, a peace offering to the Queen, to the public and to the Anglican Church. But from Camilla's perspective, it was a giant snub. Despite the fact that both she and Charles were now divorced and technically free, she felt she was being publicly consigned to a box labeled mistress. However, they were still managing to see each other, and at least she and Charles could now legitimately go away together. They could even stay with some friends who'd been uncomfortable about inviting them while they were still married to other people. Otherwise, Camilla stayed largely under the radar. Her face was well known, and thanks to all the books and tapes and television programs, she'd become one of the most hated women in Britain. And was about to become even more infamous, when devastating news broke about Diana's death in a Paris underpass.